Hello again. Economists endorse free markets because they are Pareto efficient and oppose government intervention in markets because they claim that they are not Pareto efficient. We covered this in Chapter 2, so let's remind ourselves what this means. In the unregulated free market, rich families live in 5,000 square feet apartments here, and poor families live somewhere here. This is Pareto efficient because the poor cannot afford to buy the rich out. If the government intervenes and imposes rent control, both rich and poor live here, but the apartments are smaller, just 1,000 square feet each. This is not Pareto efficient, economists say, because if subletting is legal, the rich will buy their poor neighbors out, and all the apartments will end up in the hands of the rich anyway. This chapter will show that this is not necessarily so. Once the poor move in, the rich will probably not be able to afford to buy them out. We will be using rent control as our example for government intervention because it is a burning issue everywhere. Rent control has always been a local law, but in February 2019, Oregon became the first to pass a state rent control law, and by October, California followed suit. In January 2020, Atlanta asked the Georgia legislature to rescind the state law that prohibits rent control in that state. These buildings, which we just saw, are in New York City, and they come with many location amenities. They overlook Central Park. They are served by several subway and bus lines. They are near many excellent public schools. They are close to major museums, such as the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Natural History. And by the way, these museums are free to New York City residents. They are also close to the Hudson River. These publicly constructed and owned amenities are what makes these apartments attractive. A richer family is able to pay for a 1,000 square feet apartment a rent of $5,000 a month, while a middle-class family can only afford to pay $2,000 a month for the same apartment. The market would give the apartment and all the location amenities that come with it to the richer family, and this would be Pareto efficient because the poorer family won't be able to buy the richer family out. With rent control of, say, $1,000 a month, the poorer family may get the apartment. Would this be Pareto efficient? The test is this. Suppose the richer family offers it $5,000 a month to sublet the apartment. Would the poorer family agree? There is terminology that can assist us in thinking about this question. Economists distinguish between the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept. The willingness to pay is the price that the person is willing to pay for a good she does not have. It's the same as our old reservation price. In our example, the willingness to pay of a poorer family for an apartment is $2,000. The willingness to accept is the price a person demands to give up a good she already possesses. And even though the poorer family is only willing to pay up to $2,000 for the apartment, once it has it for less than that, its willingness to accept may be well over $5,000. Measurements of the relationship between people's willingness to pay for a good and their willingness to accept for the same good find that the willingness to accept is on average 7 times higher than the willingness to pay. This means that on average, a family that is willing to pay for an apartment $2,000 a month would only agree to sublet it for more than $14,000 a month. Here is a real-life example of the power of the difference between the willingness to pay and the willingness to accept. A homeowner can always get the market price for a home, yet homeowners sell their homes only infrequently. On average, homeowners sell once every 13 years. Why? Because over long stretches of time, a homeowner's willingness to accept is well above the market price. The market price for a home may be $150,000, but if her willingness to accept is $500,000, she will not sell. When her circumstances change, a new job requires a move, or a child is born, the willingness to accept plunges to the level of the market price, and a sale occurs. Why are there such remarkable differences between different regions of the country is of course an interesting question. In an online economics book, economist Janet Hendricks explains the economist's argument why the government should not intervene in the market. Let's read it. Equity and efficiency. The case for no government intervention, other than to facilitate perfect competition, is that the competitive equilibrium is Pareto efficient. The market, in a completely decentralized way, achieves this through the price mechanism. There is a role for government, but it is to remove barriers to competitive trade. But as we saw, this is only half true. The market is Pareto efficient, but because of the large difference between the willingness to accept and the willingness to pay, so also is government intervention. When poor and middle-class families get necessities that they cannot afford, most would not sell these necessities to rich families to get cash. The willingness to accept of the poor and the middle class may be higher than the willingness to pay of the rich. Let's summarize our discussion. Both government intervention and the market are Pareto efficient. Government intervention is also utilitarian efficient because it gives necessities to the families that need them most. In the case of housing, location determines proximity to public assets like public transportation, parks, museums, the shoreline, or nature in general. Government intervention increases equity because the opportunity to use and enjoy these public assets should not be limited to the rich. Because the willingness to accept is so much higher than the willingness to pay, the way that the government goes about eminent domain should be changed dramatically. The government uses eminent domain to clear neighborhoods in order to make room for new projects. Most those who lose their homes are renters in what the government calls slums. Sometimes there are also lower middle-class families, and one such case, Kilo versus the town of New London, reached the Supreme Court. Eminent domain is in the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment reads, "Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation." The power to take private property is a remarkable government power, and it was created by authors who believed in limited government. How and why did it come about? The origin is in a 1785 letter from Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, the future author of the Fifth Amendment and the rest of the Bill of Rights. Jefferson lived in France at the time and was breathing the utilitarian air of Paris on the eve of the French Revolution. "The earth is given as a common stock for men to labor and live on," Jefferson wrote. Individuals have a right to occupy parts of the land that belongs to all as private property, but only as long as this is beneficial to society at large. This is why the government, as the representative of the people, must be the eminent owner of the land or domain. The government must use the land for the benefit of all. How? A government taking must reflect the common ownership of both the land and the location amenities. Therefore, a taking must increase total utility in society, and the chance of being harmed by the taking must be equalized among all families. In the 1950s, John D. Rockefeller III initiated the creation of a cultural center in New York City that would have a ballet theater, an opera house, and a concert hall. The center would be named for President Lincoln. To make room for the center, the city government decreed that the San Juan Hill neighborhood would be declared a slum and cleared by the application of the Fifth Amendment, which gave the government the power of eminent domain. The neighborhood was home to more than 7,000 families and 800 businesses. The residents were almost exclusively Black and Hispanic, and this is how the neighborhood got its name. During the Spanish-American War, the San Juan Hill in Cuba was valiantly conquered by a Black regiment. All would have to leave. Quite ironic that residents of a Black neighborhood named for Black heroes would lose it to a center named for President Lincoln. Given the high prices of the tickets, few, if any, of the displaced would be able to visit the new center as patrons, and few would probably want to, because opera, classical music, and ballet are mostly European. Given this destruction and displacement, would the project serve a public purpose? A government official in charge of slum clearance was Robert Moses. In 1953, he gave a talk to a group of union construction workers from the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 3, who directly benefited from slum clearance because of the construction jobs it created. Let's listen to his calculation.
At 20 Lexington Avenue, your city station brings you an address by the Honorable Robert Moses, Commissioner of Parks. The Commissioner's audience here is composed of a group of members of Local 3 of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the men who are responsible for the reinstallation of electrical work all over the city. Here now to talk on the rebuilding of New York is Commissioner Moses.
I want to talk to you quite informally and without any manuscript or notes about the condition of the city today as it affects the construction business. Now, it isn't only the cost. Somehow or other, we must find the means of meeting that. But there's the problem of moving people, which gets more serious all the time. I don't honestly believe that, considering the large numbers of people we've had to move out of the way of public housing and other public improvements, arterial improvements, schools and parks and whatnot, I don't believe that we've done any very substantial amount of harm. You're never going to get unanimous approval of any of these projects. If you try to please everybody, you're not going to accomplish anything. There must be people who are discommoded, inconvenienced, or call it what you will, on the old theory that you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs.
But the families sentenced to displacement did not believe the project was worthwhile. Shelter before culture, they protested, but they were totally ignored and given no relocation assistance. The Constitution requires compensation of owners, but they were renters. That the Constitution ignored renters is not surprising. In 1791, when the Constitution was ratified, only white male property owners had the right to vote, and the amendment reflects only their concerns. Nevertheless, the question whether renters should be compensated merits an answer. Displaced renters stop paying the rent in one place and are free to pay it in another place. What would they be compensated for then? Before we delve into this theoretical question, here is what actually happened. Many of those displaced from the San Juan Hill ended up in slums in the Bronx, places that President Carter visited 20 years later on a trip that he called sobering, but that nevertheless did not move him to send help. The government literally demolished these families' homes, and it did it for the benefit of wealthier people. But to compensate for what the government had destroyed would be big government, and raising taxes on those who benefited from the destruction would be to tax and spend. Back to our theoretical question, though. Because it is theoretical, we can assume for a moment that the displaced could find equally desirable apartments in other neighborhoods and for exactly the same rents. If this were the case, would there be anything to compensate them for? By now, we know that it is not the market price, but the willingness to accept that measures the loss to a displaced family. If the government had to pay renters their willingness to accept minus the rent, it is not clear that Robert Moses would have talked about omelette and eggs. If in his calculations he had to recognize the full cost to his victims, it would not have been possible for him to ignore them. Whether the government should pay the full willingness to accept to displaced families is a question we will return to in a minute. The Fifth Amendment is silent about how the families who must be displaced should be chosen. But equity requires that the choice should be independent of the wealth of those affected. Not all neighborhoods are equally suitable for the placement of a particular public asset. A cultural center, for instance, must be located near a transportation hub. But among all the neighborhoods that are equally suitable, the choice should be random. If wealthy families had to be paid the value of their willingness to accept, the cost would be astronomical. Only poor families would be displaced then. But people who occupy expensive apartments are getting a disproportionate use and enjoyment of the land and location amenities that belong to all. And just compensation does not require restoration of the previous privileges. Equal protection under the law should mean that the compensation the government pays each displaced family must be the same, regardless of that family's wealth. What remains to be determined is what that compensation should be. Of course, the choice would be made by the median voter. We can only speculate what this would be when all families feel equally vulnerable. Perhaps the choice would be twice the average market price of a home offered for sale at the time that eminent domain is being used. The compensation of renters and owners should be the same, although theoretically the compensation of renters could be lowered by the rent that they would stop paying. But this would again steer eminent domain towards poor neighborhoods and should therefore be resisted. Under this compensation rule, families that have no other means to adjust to the displacement would get perhaps more than the value of their loss. But they are also the ones who were most severely deprived of access to location amenities before. Families with average incomes would break even, and the rich would have to draw on some of their own wealth in order to adjust to the change. Eminent domain for economic development. The eviction of Susette Kilo became national news when she, together with 7 of her neighbors, refused to sell their homes to the City of New London and sued when the city wanted to take the homes by the power of eminent domain. New London is a town in Connecticut that in the 1990s came on hard times. It had been losing population steadily since the 1960s, but the 1990s saw a particularly bad loss of 10% because in 1996 the federal government closed the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, which had been located in the Fort Trumbull area of the city and had employed over 1,500 people. Here is a more detailed map of the town. The town sits on the Thames River, a scenic location, and state and city leaders wanted to leverage this for economic development. Some of them had connections to Pfizer, and together with it, they devised a renewal plan. Pfizer would open a research facility on the river, and the city would transform the adjacent area into a center with restaurants, hotels and condominiums, an urban center that would be attractive to Pfizer's workers and others. The illustration depicts one version of this development. This is an aerial photograph of the area taken in the late 2000s. By then, Pfizer has already fulfilled its part of the deal and built its research facility at the bottom of the picture. The area above it is where the new development by the city should have taken place. There were some 90 properties in the area, and the city decided to clear them by the use of eminent domain if necessary. Most owners sold the property to the city willingly, but Kilo and 7 others refused. They claimed that their property, taken from them by eminent domain, would end up in the hands of private businesses like hotels and restaurants, and since none of these are public, the taking of their property would not fulfill the public use requirement in the Constitution. The court sided with New London. Let's read from the decision. Petitioner's proposal that the court adopt a new bright-line rule that economic development does not qualify as a public use is supported by neither precedent nor logic. Promoting economic development is a traditional and long-accepted governmental function, and there is no principled way of distinguishing it from the other public purposes the court has recognized. Pfizer invested some $340 million in the facility and employed 1,400 employees there. It opened the facility in 2000, but by 2009, it closed it, and this made national news. The area that was taken by eminent domain is still vacant today. But the facility that Pfizer abandoned in 2009 did not stay closed for long. In 2010, it sold it to Electric Boat, the maker of submarines, for $55 million. Electric Boat is using it as an engineering center. Several organizations supported Kilo and the other plaintiffs in their lawsuit. These organizations were the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, the AARP, which is the American Association of Retired Persons, the Hispanic Alliance of Atlantic County, Citizens in Action, Kramer Hill Resident Association, and the Southern Christian Leadership. Because local governments engage in economic development routinely, the people who are represented by these organizations suffer from eminent domain frequently, and this is why these organizations ask the court to declare that economic development is not a public purpose. The court rejected this argument. Markets are not self-regulating, and without government intervention, there is unemployment. Appealing to the court to decide that economic development is not public use is not only futile, it is even wrong. But the application of eminent domain is based on bad economics. The values of apartments or homes are not their market prices, but the willingness to accept of the families who live in them. Renters stand to lose just as much from displacement as owners do. What we need is just compensation. Let's remind ourselves what this means. The odds of displacement must be the same for all families, regardless of their incomes and whether they are renters or owners. The compensation should be the same, regardless of the incomes of the displaced and whether they are owners or renters. The compensation should be determined before need, because under pressure, the legislature may revert to harming the poor. To adjust for changing prices, the compensation may be tied to the average home price at the time of need. Food for thought. Is the willingness to accept a good substitute for utility? For what goods is it, and for what goods is it not?